Today, I have a special guest who argues that AI is going to radically remake accounting.
75% of accountants are set to retire over the next decade.
Seema is a partner on the Andreessen Horowitz Fintech Team. She and I actually had the pleasure of working together there for several years, helping to scale that practice before I left to start my own venture firm as a solo GP. Today, she was kind enough to come up from their headquarters in Soma to my offices in Jackson Square. About a year ago, she published an exhaustive market map on AI and accounting. Since then, she's been tracking the space very closely, following developments with the latest companies, speaking to accounting firms, and hearing feedback from others in and around the industry. This is going to be a great episode on what is happening, one of the core pieces of financial services. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Seema, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I want to talk about how AI is going to remake accounting, but first I just want to talk about why is accounting as a profession in a crisis, even in absence of that change?
Sure. There's two primary dynamics. One is the number of accountants is shrinking and the amount of work is only increasing. So just to put this in context of a few stats. So I think 75% of accountants are set to retire over the next decade. Mm-hmm. We saw between 2019 and 2022 a drop off of like 300,000 accountants. So there were 1.65, 300K drop off is a lot.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and so fewer people are wanting to go through these accounting programs. Some states are actually putting forward do students who want to study accounting, can they go through less work just so that they can stem this crisis? But the number of accountants is dying down. But the work is increasing. Mm-hmm. And so what you're seeing is obviously the complexity of accounting and tax and audit issues that are coming up is increasing. So if you see the number of audits that a Big Four accounting firm is increasing, and they actually measure this thing called deficiencies, which is where the company that is being audited isn't being able to produce sufficient work product for the accounting firm to finish their audit, and those are going up by 20 or 30%. And so you're seeing this increase in work, but no accountants to do it. Yeah. So it's a crisis, as you put it.
Yeah, and so fewer accountants, but it's still a big market. So help break down the shape of how big this market is in terms of head count, hours worked, all that.
Yeah. So we roughly estimate it's a $75 to $100 billion market. A lot of that is on labor spend.
Yeah.
And so you might not know this, but accounting is the fourth largest profesin, right after cashiers in the U.S.
Yep. Number one is?
I think still truck driving.
Yeah.
But that may change over time too.
Maybe also AI related.
Yeah, so also maybe AI related. A lot of that is on labor. And a lot of and that work is both done within accounting firms and then corporate accounting teams at companies.
Yeah, and total headcount across both accounting professions, but also adjacent,
there's
huge
around
category.
3 million accountants.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, totally. And so that's the size of the market. You spent a lot of time over the past year talking to both accounting startups, but also accounting firms. What do you think you've learned are the real jobs to be done by AI for those individuals?
Yeah, so I'd broadly break it out into 4 buckets. The first is around data collection and ingestion.
Yeah.
And I'll come back and explain what each of these are. Second is around research. The third is around report generation, creating filings. And then the fourth is around client advisory, answering questions, and the sort of sales process.
Yep.
The first bucket I mentioned, what is data collection and ingestion?
Yeah.
There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes for accountants and their firms to do their work. So that's pulling all the data out of bank statements, AR and AP platforms, your general ledger, pulling all of that out and then reconciling it, creating the month-end close, all of that work, which is really a data extraction exercise. But it's all in different systems and different file formats. Historically, it's just required a number of bookkeepers to create journal entries and do the work.
And I'm sure consumers listening to this are a little bit familiar. You've prepared your taxes, you go to all these systems, you grab all the PDFs, you give it to the accountant to do your taxes. And then imagine a business use case.
Totally, and you've got tons more. You have to do a month-end close. If you're a business, you have to do a month-end close.
Yeah.
A lot of times the month-end close takes half the month to do.
Yeah.
And it's a small team of people at the company or at that's outsourced an accounting firm. And that's all, again, because, you as a consumer, you might have, statements across a couple banks and brokerages, but imagine if you've got all these invoices and cash receipts and payment processing, and all of that needs to be reconciled against like contracts, et cetera. It gets infinitely more complicated.
Maybe e-commerce, so you're filing like sales tax in all 50 states.
Right. And so, like consumers, you're usually filing in one, maybe 2 states. If you're a business, you have many more filings, and then you may have to make monthly payments. It's much more complicated. And then as you graduate as a business, you have to go through the audit process, which has its own set of checklists and is quite complicated. So that's data collection and ingestion. I want to come back to that because that's actually where I think a lot of the most interesting opportunity is for AI. The second is around research. So the same way we go to ChatGPT to look up a question we have, accountants also need to go find out, like, how do you categorize something, or what's the tax treatment for a particular transaction. And so
a lot of these questions involve human judgment and skill.
Yes.
I know some people are like, oh, well, we can't use AI because like you need my judgment and skill, but my experience is different. Like I think it actually helps you get to good decisions. How do you think accountants feel about the ability to use these tools to inform judgment?
So on the research side, a lot of time is actually spent looking up two things, the code, and then how an accountant has treated this in the past with another transaction. So there's 2 pieces. It's the code and the precedent, if you will, which is not dissimilar from legal, right? Legal field. And so it cuts down a ton of time if you don't have to go and like control F a document or multiple documents.
Or search for the latest like IRS guidance or something.
Or if you have to rack your brain being like, I know I did someone else's taxes like this a long time ago, like how are you going to remember what that is? And so, I think there's the retrieval of information from a co-pilot there is valuable and can save on time. It's not a daily use case, but it's still valuable.
Yeah, I imagine the auditability too of just going back, like you can create links for these searches that spit out the information, then you grab it and you can inform why you made a decision you did.
Yeah, and it's interesting. CFOs, I chat with CFOs commonly too, and one of their most common use cases in ChatGPT is going in and asking a question about tax treatment. Yeah, and taxes are like written up. They're precise. It's like a great use case for these kinds of models. To your point, there's a lot of judgment being applied. Does this specific situation, is it, how do you apply the rule? Yeah, so. But so much of judgment is getting to the right context quickly to inform the judgment, even if it's not making the judgment itself. Yeah. Which I will also get to the two things I think are jobs to be done that can't be automated. But so the second one I mentioned was research. First was data collection. Third is report generation filing, which is creation of the audit statements, the financial statements, the tax filing. The fourth is client service and advice. So client service and advice, that's everything from answering the questions that you and I are asking our CPA. When we get a certain IRS notification, advising your clients on how they should be optimizing their taxes, or what software to be using, those types of questions. Closing the books is very different from giving strategic advice about how to improve margin, sales, tax efficiency. Exactly. And that gets me to the point of, what are the things, the first 4 buckets, there's actually a lot of room for AI to come in, especially the first 3, let's say, for AI to come in and help automate a lot of the labor that's being done. Even in the 4th bucket, can you imagine you getting advice or at least updated communication from your CPA that's it's on a regular basis, or and the CPA certainly would rather have a more regular touch point with you, the customer, again, generated by AI. But I think at the end of the day, judgment and sales are probably the 2 areas that are the last to be automated, and that's what you're really looking for from a professional when you're thinking about working with an accountant. Yeah, I think sometimes people are like, oh, it's just categorizing transactions, but there's some things AI is really good at, like data extraction and automation with the rote stuff. There's some surprising things, which it's maybe not making the judgment for you, but it helps you get to a judgment faster. Totally. And I think in that first bucket, data collection, it sounds really boring. That's a huge amount of time bookkeeping. I mentioned a lot about the labor shortages. Bookkeepers are incredibly on short demand, and there's a lot of this outsourced labor for that, and that's actually the whole foundation. Like if you have crappy, stale data, you can't provide any advice because you're looking too far. You're too far back, in terms of or out of date, let's say, in terms of your advice being provided, and so that data collection ingestion piece can actually be a really good sort of jumping off point for additional services.
And once you've wrangled all that data, applied good judgment to it, as long as it's well structured, generating the various reports off of that core body gets a lot easier as well.
Totally. And that data part, if you go back to the why, so why is accounting dying? Part of it is, I mentioned the number of hours you have to go through to, training, 150 hours and plus on the school side and the exams. It's also the work, right? Like it's just this repetitive work. And imagine if software enabled you as the human to be the reviewer rather than the doer. So instead of you needing to create the journal entry, the software presented a journal entry that has an auditable trail, and then you're like, okay, great. Now I can make sure this is correct and sort of apply my judgment versus needing to, manually, wait for someone else or doing it myself, enter the numbers, check if they're right, attach all the documents and all that stuff.
Yeah, you've been spending a lot of time talking to accounting firms. You kind of laid out these 4 jobs to be done. And it's like, great, they're like clearly things that AI can help with today. But when you go to talk to accounting firms, what's the headspace they're in about actually starting to use these tools?
They're incredibly excited. We have talked to a number of accounting firms, different sizes, everyone from the big 4 down to anywhere in the top 200, and they're extremely excited to invest in these tools because they see that recruiting people across skill and tenure level is getting harder, and they want their work to become more efficient. And so a lot of them have approached us saying, like, please introduce us to whoever you can that you've met. We'd love to work with more software.
Yeah. And what are the challenges for them, though, in terms of adopting these tools? Like, one thing you'll often hear is like, oh, accountants can't adopt it because like it has to be so precise, and if there's any errors, so like they can't use it. Or another thing you might hear is like, oh, we get pitched too many solutions, so like which ones do we use? So like, what are the friction points, though, in terms of actually rolling out some of this stuff? Whether real or imagined.
Those are 2 super valid concerns that we hear. People don't go into accounting because they're necessarily the most creative, risk-taking folks, and neither do you want your accountant to be like that, right? And so I think that's part of the rollout issue. A lot of them want to try this. They don't want to make a mistake and lose trust with their customers. Yeah. I think I'm of the view, and many people, and I don't know if you are too, that actually AI can probably do a better job than the human, but it's sort of like how we've seen autonomous cars and self-driving be treated. Like you're just held to a higher standard, right? Yeah. So there's an issue around trust, getting an accuracy. There's also just people have been doing things a certain way, and inserting software to fundamentally change the process can be disruptive or just get pushback, as we've seen in legal and other professional services as well.
It is a bit ironic that a machine can often be as accurate as a human, but they're held to 10x the standard.
Totally.
In the case of self-driving cars, probably roughly a 50x standard in terms of safety expectations for a machine versus say a teenage driver.
Totally. But the interesting thing, right? So many people use like TurboTax, right? And have been using other tax software for such a long time on the consumer side, and that is a very much a piece of software that's doing all the calculation, and they've trusted it, right? In fact, it's a great business. So I'm optimistic, but I also think the firms have it's people staking the reputation, so I think they feel a little more hesitant. The other piece that I think is a little bit more nuanced is that firms have felt that they've trained people by them coming up the ranks of being a junior accountant, doing the work, the work involving the data extraction, the reconciliation. So they see how things work, and that training is valuable. But my response to that is, we didn't stop using calculators because they came out. We just became better at checking our work and using the calculator and figuring out how to triangulate when there were errors. So
I think there is a cultural aspect of how you train folks that is underappreciated. Like when higher level programming languages came out, they're like, oh, like you can't like code in Python. You got to code in C. You can't code in C. You got to code in like machine assembly. And you're like, well, do you? It's like now you can vibe code. And that changes the profession.
Right.
The on-ramps, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's interesting to see. I also wonder why, I feel like some startups in AI have really seized the imaginations for verticals in legal, like Harvey has gotten a ton of press. We haven't seen that happen in accounting. Why do you think that might be the case? Might that change in the future?
I think LLMs are best still suited towards language versus numbers and calculations. So I think that's part of it. I think it's taken a little more time for this space, but we've probably met like 50 plus startups in the accounting space. So I think that it's coming. And then I think this other piece around LLMs being better at retrieval versus reasoning, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot in that first bucket of data collection and ingestion can be automated, or parts of it at least can be significantly automated, or the research co-pilots that exist do end up creating time savings. But that's not automating the whole job. And I think if you look at even the legal startups, a lot of it is doing parts of it versus automating it all. And so I think even legal, while it's grown, I think there's still some ways to go before it's supplanting the whole job. Yeah, totally. And we talked about how accounting firms. So we talked about like the jobs to be done. We talked about accounting firms and how they're thinking about implementing some of these technology. I want to also take a little bit of like a founder perspective. So if you're trying to build an AI accounting company, one of the questions you have to think about is not just like what product should you build, but also how should you bring that product to market? Should you sell? And this is what I'd love to hear your perspective on. What are the advantages of a founder, or the questions a founder should be thinking about if they are thinking about selling directly to companies, selling to companies but through accountants as a channel where the accountant is recommending a service, versus just tooling straight to accountants that's maybe totally invisible to the end consumer. So kind of three different approaches, but like what do you think about in terms of understanding those various go-to-markets? I think I would just say like, okay, there's two paths. I think they're both interesting. I think what we're seeing right now is I think firms are probably a little more interested in trying out software. And to your point, there's many more entry points, and you can spread it across the firm versus selling into individual departments. And oftentimes I think the teams at companies look to their firms for advice. But you can certainly build an interesting business either if you have a good distribution advantage at the SMB side, or you're able to you've got something where you can spread your tentacles across a finance team.
And it is different if you're doing something like a pure accounting workflow. The business owner often doesn't care about accounting that much, and so they might not be that engaged. Whereas if you're selling to the accountant, they might really care and be like highly engaged.
That's why you sort of have to either be super upmarket or like down really like at the SMB side, where you're just like solving the problem for them completely.
All right, you want me to re-ask you the question?
Sure.
You take it. So we talked about how AI is going to change it for accounting, the practitioners, and what jobs to be done they're seeing changing. If you're a founder building the space, how should you think about go-to-market, selling to accounting firms versus selling to the businesses who hire and employ accountants?
Yeah, I think the underlying tech that you start with around is, probably whether it's a Copilot or data collection is fairly similar. But if I had to pick between those two camps, it's probably a little bit easier to sell into accounting firms, just because you can plant the flag and expand across the firm. And then oftentimes you can start with something like CAS and then move into audit and tax. And you've created a relationship with them over time. Selling into companies and in corporate accounting teams there can totally work as well. You can similarly, move from the order to cash team into the monthly close team. You have to just be sort of strategic, but a lot of times that's a totally new sale. And accounting teams often look to their firms for advice. And so if you have the ear of the accounting firms, or you're already in there, that's even better. And then there's also like obviously the down market SMB side of the market, and that there's always the age-old challenge of distributing to SMBs. But for them, like, you really have to completely solve their pain point, because those business owners don't want to spend any time.
Yeah.
And again, they often look to their accountants. So if you look at like the Bill.coms of the world, right, they sold through the accounting channel because a lot of those accountants were actually doing the work, the accounting work for those firms. So yeah, on balance, I'd say the accounting firms, there can be really interesting ways to construct a big business on the company side as well. You just have to be a little more strategic about how you think about expanding your tentacles over time.
Yeah, and it comes down to knowing your customer. There are areas where it almost always makes sense to start with the accounting firms, which would be like very small SMB clients if you're doing stuff there. But moving to the mid-market probably still is what I'm hearing. But then it starts to depend exactly as you move a little bit more market. Yeah, absolutely. You published your initial piece like a year ago. You've had a lot of time to talk to startups, to accounting firms, and also just think about the space, not to mention watch models get better and better. What's the biggest way you've updated your thinking since, say, a year ago?
I think I am excited, speaking of models, your reasoning is getting better, which is awesome to see. And so I think we're not super far away from the models being able to do more and really move away from just doing retrieval. So that's one thing that's changed, and it's I'm even in the next year, I'm excited to see what happens. As I was mentioning, we've seen a lot of accounting firms, chomping at the bit to try this software. It's been slower to see them actually adopt. And part of that is the risk aversion. Part of it is honestly, again, like this bank statement piece, like connecting with all of the banks, the long tail, someone who may not be a part of a bank that may not be on Plaid or whatever.
And that's still really hard. People think, oh, Plaid has solved consumer, and it's pretty good in consumer, but it's not fixed. And then you go to B2B accounts, it does not work particularly
Plaid's
well.
great, but I think there's a lot of coverage that still needs to be built out. Even getting ERP integrations, and I can touch a little bit on this, like horizontal versus vertical. It just takes time, and so that's something we've noticed. I think the other piece has also been around just thinking around what product actually sells and works. I think like any industry, I think. Some of the startups we've seen have pitched a very ambitious vision, and the product doesn't work, and nothing on.
I know you had a piece that was like the slingshot versus Goliath, which would be one idea of thinking about product wedges. Maybe that's that kind of.
I think here that's like the data extraction piece, right? If you take something like transaction categorization.
And what is that framework? Just
yes. Okay, so I wrote about this last year. It's this idea of using AI as a wedge to take on an incumbent. There are a number of these. So whether it's workflow automation, a voice agent, transcription, those are all things that are kind of create these magical products that make it really exciting for a customer to use you, and then you use that as sort of the slingshot, as you will, to take on a much larger system of record because you collect that data that system of record has over time. So in the case of accounting,
if you tell an accountant like, oh, I want to replace like QuickBooks, they'd be like, But
no
you're
way.
Like, oh, here's this magical experience on top of QuickBooks that does this great thing.
And if you build trust over time and you keep doing more and you're better than the system of record because you have more accuracy, you have more data, it's not stale, people, they're like, oh, okay, I'll keep giving you more. But in the case of accounting, so transaction categorization is not new. I mean, like OCR has existed, but now LLM-powered OCR, you're able to work with different file formats. It's a lot more accurate. It's faster. And so that's like something that suddenly it is magical if you're able to do this ingestion and parse it out and then create the trail that's auditable more easily versus a more rigid rules-based system. And so that's actually something we have seen in a number of startups, sort of both across the accounting, tax, audit side. You can imagine like being able to immediately populate an audit checklist. That's pretty magical and saves a lot of time versus I think the last generation of software is just creating the workflow for the human, the auditor to go in and check things off versus now it's like pre-populated and the auditor can verify that that's correct.
Yeah. So I think AI is definitely going to change the process of accounting. It'll probably change to some extent like the product of accounting, like maybe you focus more on advisory services, value-added things. But I'm also curious to hear your take on how it changes the business model of accounting, because the business model of accounting is the billable hour, and like, how does that work? You said at the top of this podcast, 75 billion to 100 billion in wages. Like, what happens to the business model of accounting when software is doing work that humans used to do?
Yeah, well, TBD to see how that goes. But the interesting thing is there's both, like, your tax work is done on an hourly basis. Audit's a fixed fee. And it's not dissimilar, again, from legal, right? So if you look at legal, transaction work is very different from litigation, which is based on an hourly basis versus, and so, but even like the legal field is changing, right?
Yeah. You can get a lot more fixed fee legal engagements or even accounting engagements than used to be the case.
Right, exactly. And so I think we're going to move more towards fixed fee. And then going back to this idea of like advisory work and advice, if you're able to do more on that front, there's probably a new whole pricing model that comes out of that, and the type of work that you're able to provide people when it's not just based on the hours to sort of churn through this machine, but it's based more on the strategic advice that a firm can provide.
Yeah. I'm also curious where accounting and bookkeeping gets bundled into other software offerings versus not. It's definitely not going to get bundled everywhere. Like, the world's too big. There's too many different kinds of businesses. But do you have a perspective on where it might be embedded into like vertical SaaS versus standalone?
We're already seeing that. There are, and I'm sure you've seen them, they're embedded accounting providers. And it makes a ton of sense too, because a lot of the accounting work and bookkeeping work in particular ends up being vertical. What does that mean? So if you take healthcare versus insurance versus construction, they all have different ERPs, different ways of coding things, and then different processes for even how you do the billing. And your accounting system needs to be able to pick up and understand how that coding works. And it's very different for different industries. And so I think that can make a lot of sense. And then I think also from a distribution perspective, we were talking about earlier, right? If you're going after the SMB, it's always been a tough challenge. It's a natural piece if you've got the general ledger of the business there.
If a vertical SaaS platform has 100,000 end SMBs on the platform, they have distribution. And to your point, maybe the big problem is, like, LLMs make categorization easy, but maybe not integration to the right system. Vertical SaaS platforms usually have solved for distribution and integration, so maybe for certain categories.
And they probably can provide more context too, which would be helpful.
Yeah, which is really getting broader context around, and then the fine tuning around, like, okay, this is this industry, so it should be these codes. That just needs some tweaking.
Totally.
As well.
If you look at these CAS departments I was mentioning earlier, they often are sort of vertical pods or vertical teams within the firm, so it actually aligns with that. Yeah.
I'm always thinking about rebundling because I think we're like going to see rebundling on steroids. I think accounting will be like a little bit of a piece of that, but there's also plenty of standalone places to develop interesting accounting software. Anything else you're like excited about or paying close attention to in the world of accounting?
No, I think I touched on most of it. No, I think there's a lot that's exciting. And do you have any, like, where do you like to go to like learn about what's changed? Like, who do you usually talk to, call, read? So great question. I, maybe 2 years ago, stumbled upon tax Twitter. Like, there's an incredible enthusiasm online from this community, whether it's on Twitter or just, YouTube or wherever. And so I've learned a lot from talking to some of these influencers, et cetera. So this, and a lot of ex-CPAs who are like, oh my gosh, I just wish the industry would change for X, Y, and Z reason. We've actually spent a lot of time with firms as well, because they're incredibly excited to invest, and it's across the firm, not just like the leadership wanting to change things, but also obviously like anyone in an individual practice is also like, how do I make my teams more efficient? So we spent a lot of time with them trying to understand like what are their pain points, what has worked, what hasn't. And then we've met a lot of startups. And I think the really interesting thing about the startups we've met, I'd say more than less, the startups it's folks who haven't come from the accounting space in any way. Which you may say, okay, well, like, how are they going to get distribution? But like, if they're savvy salespeople and really understand and spend time with these firms that are very eager to talk to folks who can help their lives, you can build a great startup.
Yeah, and they've got better tooling to build these slingshots, I think, pretty quickly in a way that's exciting.
Right.
Yeah, I've been blown away by some of the niche communities on like Reddit or YouTube. Especially on YouTube, you'll watch like these accounting or tax videos that have like 1 million views and are very sophisticated. You're like, where are these people that care about this stuff?
The amount of outreach we've gotten after publishing content on this space it's blown me away, and I love the enthusiasm. It's awesome.
Yeah, no, I'm super excited to see what happens with accounting because if we get better accounting, faster, cheaper, integrated into more things, I think all of us consumers win in the end.
Totally.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on. It's been great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.